The night it happened didn't carry the kind of storm people later swore they remembered. There was no thunder shaking the windows, no lightning splitting the sky over the quiet suburban street, and no warning carried by the wind. It was an ordinary October evening, 2 degrees colder than usual, and the kind of quiet that makes every small sound feel like a secret whisper. Inside the Harper residence, a warm glow spilled from the living room lamps, casting soft gold light across the carefully arranged family photos on the mantel. Anniversaries, vacations, smiling faces that would soon mean something very different. Up until that night, no one had guessed that the marriage behind those frames was already rotting beneath polished smiles and curated dignity. Daniel Harper sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the printout in his hands. It was the third time he'd read it, but the numbers didn't change. $9.1 million. The valuation of the company he'd built from nothing, the valuation of his life's work. Earlier that week, he had finally updated the succession documents, sealing them in an envelope he believed would secure the future of the family he cherished. But what Daniel didn't know was that even before the ink dried, someone in that same house had already decided how his story would end. Someone who knew his routines, his vulnerabilities, and the exact night his guard would drop. The refrigerator hummed behind him. A clock ticked softly somewhere down the hallway. Outside, the distant sound of a car passing by flickered through the silence before fading altogether. Daniel took a slow breath. He didn't hear the light footsteps approaching. Not yet. He didn't see the look in her eyes, Basu. Not yet. All he felt was the familiar ache in his temples, the exhaustion of years spent fighting market downturns, staffing shortages, and the quiet fear of losing everything he'd built. He had no idea that the person he believed he'd shared his life with had already made a choice that would rewrite the narrative of his existence forever. Upstairs, a phone buzzed. A brief vibration, quickly silenced. The message on the screen flashed once before disappearing into darkness. No one was supposed to see it. No one was supposed to suspect a thing. The plan had been unfolding for months, woven through whispered calls, carefully deleted messages, and promises exchanged between two people who thought they were smarter than fate. But the truth has a way of seeping through the cracks, even when every precaution has been taken. And on that night, the first crack had opened. Before the house fell quiet again, before the footsteps reached the kitchen doorway, before Daniel finally realized he wasn't alone, a different voice, one buried deep in his memory, echoed faintly inside him. His attorney's words from earlier that week. Once this is filed, you become a very wealthy man, Daniel. Just be sure you trust the people closest to you. At the time, Daniel had laughed it off. Betrayal wasn't something he worried about. Not from family, not from a woman he believed had stood by his side for 19 years. He lifted his head at the sound of fabric brushing against the doorframe. "You're still awake?" he asked softly, unaware that this simple moment was the final instance of his life spent believing he was safe. Before we go deeper into this chilling case, take a moment and ground yourself. Let the room around you settle. As this story unfolds, I want you to listen closely to every detail, every choice, every moment where trust quietly cracked. And while you do, you're welcome to share your thoughts in the comments. What instinct would you have followed first if you were standing in Daniel Harper's place? Sometimes understanding a tragedy starts with imagining how easily we might walk into one without ever sensing the danger. The Harpers were not the kind of family that drew attention. They lived in a quiet neighborhood just outside the city, a community where neighbors waved from their driveways and holiday decorations appeared like clockwork the first week of December. Daniel, now in his late 40s, had risen from a modest childhood to become a respected entrepreneur, running a logistics company that had expanded across 3 states. Reports describe him as patient, meticulous, and generous with both his employees and his community. The kind of man people trusted instinctively, the kind who believed honesty was the default setting of the world. His wife, Claire, carried a different kind of charm. Soft-spoken, elegant, and always perfectly composed, she was known for the quiet grace she brought to neighborhood gatherings and charity events. But beneath her polished demeanor, there were rumors, subtle, drifting, nothing more than whispers shared between people who swore they didn't judge. Whispers about distance in the marriage, about Claire spending more time downtown, about a man she seemed to talk to just a little too comfortably at a fundraising gala. No one said these things loudly. No one believed they mattered. Not until it was too late. For years, Claire had lived as the grieving, patient wife who smiled at the right moments and kept her doubts hidden. She would tell friends, allegedly, in confidence, that Daniel's long work hours were beginning to erode their relationship, that he no longer listened the way he used to, that he had changed. But those closest to the couple later insisted that it was Claire who had changed first. That something in her grew colder around the time Daniel's company earned its first multi-million-dollar valuation, that her gaze shifted from affection to calculation. Their daughter Lily, only 16 at the time, sensed the distance long before the adults admitted it. She would sit at the top of the stairs, listening to the muted, half-finished arguments drifting from the kitchen below. Nothing violent, nothing explosive, just two people drifting in different directions, like lines that once ran parallel, now bending into separate worlds. She didn't yet understand that sometimes the silence between two people can be more dangerous than any shouted words. Daniel attributed the tension to stress, business negotiations, the impending restructuring of his company, the pressure of managing assets he had never imagined owning. He believed, genuinely, that when the dust settled, things would return to normal. He didn't know that Claire had already found solace elsewhere, that she had confided in another man, one who promised her affection, excitement, and most importantly, escape. The man's name was Evan Mercer, a financial advisor with a polished smile, expensive suits, and a way of making people feel seen. He and Claire had allegedly met during a charity luncheon the previous year. What began as casual conversations about investments had quickly shifted into something far more intimate. According to phone records later retrieved by investigators, their communication escalated dramatically during the months leading up to Daniel's death. Dozens of late-night calls, messages deleted minutes after they were read, and transfers of money Claire could never convincingly explain. Reports suggest that Evan was the one who first learned about the updated succession documents. Claire had mentioned it during what she later described as an emotional conversation, words she would eventually regret. Because it was Evan who posed the question that changed everything. Do you realize what your life would look like if he suddenly wasn't here? No one knows exactly what Claire felt in that moment. Fear, temptation, desperation, or all three. But that question planted a seed, and that seed grew into the plan that would unravel every truth the Harpers once believed in. On the night Daniel died, everything had been arranged down to the smallest detail. Claire had waited until he was exhausted, waited until his guard was low, waited until the house settled into that comforting stillness he found after long days. And then she executed the plan she thought would free her. She didn't know that the smallest mistake, a single overlooked detail, would eventually expose the entire truth. And that mistake was already in motion. Down the hall, Lily had forgotten her headphones in the study. She would later say that something felt wrong even before she reached the bottom step. A heaviness in the air, a sensation she couldn't explain. And when she turned the corner toward the kitchen, she caught a glimpse of something she wasn't meant to see. A shadow, a movement, a whispered phrase she would later repeat to detectives. It has to be tonight. She froze. She tried to steady her breathing, and just for a moment the world held its breath with her. What happened next, the moment that changed the entire Harper legacy, was quiet. No screams, no chaos, just a sudden, unnatural stillness that made Lily's skin crawl, a stillness that told her something irreversible had just happened. And that stillness was the first sign that a $9.1 million secret was about to be exposed. The stillness lingered in the air, like the echo of a scream no one had heard. Lily remained frozen near the doorway, her fingers trembling around the strap of the bag she still held. She didn't dare move. She didn't dare call out. She just listened, heart pounding, breath tightening, mind racing through every childhood memory of this house that suddenly felt foreign. A scent drifted toward her, faint but strange, like something burned, something metallic. It didn't make sense. Nothing about this night made sense. And before she could summon the courage to step forward, she heard her mother's voice, low, controlled, almost rehearsed. It's done. Two words that would haunt Lily for the rest of her life. When investigators later asked what she felt in that moment, she said it wasn't fear. Not exactly. It was a realization, dawning and cold, that the woman she had trusted her entire life was part of something she didn't understand. She stepped backward slowly, the floorboards creaking beneath her weight. Claire didn't hear her, or if she did, she chose not to acknowledge it. She was too focused on the next step of a plan she believed was flawless. But plans built on deceit rarely survive the smallest fracture. And tonight, that fracture had already opened. Claire wiped her hands on a towel, glancing at the clock glowing above the stove. Everything had been calculated, everything timed. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and typed a message she never should have sent. "It's finished. Come by the house in 40 minutes." She expected reassurance, a quick reply, something to solidify the promise Evan had whispered to her on so many late nights. But the message didn't deliver. The signal was weak, another detail she had overlooked. Meanwhile, Lily slipped back upstairs, her breath shallow, her thoughts spiraling into fear she couldn't articulate. She reached her room and shut the door quietly, pressing her back against it. Her legs felt weak. Her mind begged her to pretend nothing had happened. But a part of her, the part that inherited Daniel's instinct for truth, refused to stay silent. Downstairs, Claire composed herself. She poured water over the kitchen sink as though rinsing away an ordinary mess. She rehearsed the story she would tell the authorities. She had come downstairs for tea, found Daniel unconscious, and panicked when she realized he wasn't breathing. She had even timed her call to emergency services for maximum plausibility. Everything depended on precision. Everything depended on belief. But the universe has a way of unraveling careful lies. 40 minutes passed. Evan didn't arrive. Another 10, another 15. Claire's confidence began to crack. She tried calling him, once, twice, 3 times. Each attempt went straight to voicemail. Anxiety curled in her stomach, and for the first time since the plan began, she felt a tremor of fear. She didn't know that Evan had his own secrets. She didn't know that the man she trusted had made a choice she never anticipated. Because while Claire was preparing her story, Evan was sitting in his downtown apartment, staring at a different message, a warning. A colleague had sent it earlier in the evening, alerting him that an internal audit might expose financial discrepancies connected to several of his accounts. One of those accounts was Claire's. If investigators dug deeper, they might find money transfers tying him directly to her. For Evan, the risk shifted instantly. Claire was no longer a partner. She was evidence. And evidence had to be eliminated or avoided entirely. He didn't go to the house because he had already decided his future no longer included her. Back on the quiet street, Claire finally made the call. Her voice trembled just enough to sound convincing. "It's my husband," she said breathlessly. "I think he collapsed. He's not responding." She gave the address, her tone tight with forced panic. "Please hurry." By the time paramedics arrived, the street had fallen into another brief stretch of silence. Lights flickered across the front windows, casting shadows onto the manicured lawn. Neighbors peeked through blinds, whispering to spouses, wondering what tragedy had struck a family they believed was stable and kind. None of them imagined the truth lurking behind those walls. Not yet. Inside the house, Daniel Harper lay motionless on the kitchen floor. His eyes were slightly open, his expression frozen somewhere between confusion and betrayal. Paramedics worked quickly, performing every protocol, but within minutes they knew. They exchanged a look, subtle but heavy. One turned to Claire. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, he's gone." Claire collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands. Not a single tear fell at first. She forced her shoulders to shake, mimicking the grief she believed she was supposed to feel. The paramedic beside her placed a hand on her arm, offering quiet comfort. He didn't know he was consoling the architect of the tragedy. Upstairs, Lily heard the commotion. She didn't rush down. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the floor, trying to process the words she'd overheard. "It has to be tonight." That phrase carved itself deeper into her thoughts. When she finally stepped into the hallway, she felt a chill crawl along her spine. For the rest of the night, the house filled with voices, officers, medical personnel, neighbors offering support. Claire answered every question with poise. She claimed Daniel had been under immense stress. She mentioned his headaches. She played the part of a devastated widow with precision. But one officer, Detective Harris, watched her carefully. His instincts sharpened as he observed her mannerisms. The lack of shock, the controlled breathing, the timing of her call, little things, almost invisible, but not to him. "Did you touch anything after you found him?" he asked. Claire hesitated, only for a fraction of a second, but he noticed. I don't remember, she replied softly. I think I tried to help him up. Harris nodded, but his mind was already working through inconsistencies. We'll take your statement in the morning. When the last responder left, the house returned to a fragile quiet. Claire went upstairs to check on Lily, who pretended to be half asleep. Claire kissed her forehead gently, the same lips that had whispered betrayal hours earlier. We'll get through this, she said. I promise. Lily didn't respond. She waited until her mother was gone. Then she reached under her pillow and pulled out her phone. Her hands still trembled slightly as she pressed record. Mom wasn't shocked, she whispered into the microphone. She said something in the kitchen before Dad. I think something's wrong. I think she did something. Those words, captured in a frightened teenager's voice, would become the thread that pulled the entire case apart. The next day, the autopsy confirmed suspicions. Daniel hadn't collapsed. He hadn't suffered a stroke or heart attack. Toxicology revealed traces of a rare synthetic compound often used in microdosed form for illicit poisoning, something that required planning, research, and access to certain restricted chemicals, something that couldn't be accidentally ingested. Detective Harris returned to the Harper home with a different tone. This time, he wasn't offering condolences. He was digging. Claire answered the door with swollen eyes, though investigators later noted that her tissues appeared clean and unused. She ushered the detective inside, maintaining her grief-stricken performance. He began gently. When was the last time you and your husband ate together? Last night, she answered. We had leftover pasta. Did you prepare it? Yes, but I didn't taste anything strange. He nodded, taking notes. And where were you between 9 and midnight? I was home, she replied quickly. Just here. Harris looked up. Anyone who can confirm that? Her hesitance returned, a 2-second pause she couldn't disguise. My daughter, she said softly. She was upstairs. He made another note. That pause meant something. Everything meant something. Later that afternoon, he asked to speak with Lily privately. She sat across from him, her hands fidgeting, her eyes distant. I need you to answer honestly, Harris began. Did you notice anything unusual last night? Lily swallowed hard. Her voice cracked slightly. I heard something, she whispered. Mom said something in the kitchen. Something like, it has to be tonight. The room fell still. Harris leaned forward. Lily, are you sure? She nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. She didn't know I was there. That statement, quiet, fragile, truthful, shifted the entire investigation. What had looked like a sudden medical tragedy now shimmered with the unmistakable outline of intent. Within days, a warrant was issued. Officers combed through the Harper home meticulously. In the kitchen's trash bin, they found a small glass vial masked beneath layers of discarded packaging. Lab results confirmed it contained residue of the same synthetic compound found in Daniel's bloodstream. In Claire's car, they discovered a crumpled note with a phone number written in hurried handwriting. Evan's number. And on Claire's phone, despite her attempts to wipe data, forensic specialists recovered fragments of deleted messages, enough to hint at an affair, enough to suggest conspiracy. But nothing prepared investigators for the biggest revelation, Daniel's updated succession documents. Filed just 3 days before his death, they transferred controlling interest of the company to Lily, not Claire. Claire would receive a fixed allowance but no direct control, and the life insurance policy, worth several million, named Lily as the sole beneficiary until adulthood. When Harris read the documents, everything clicked. Claire didn't just want freedom, she wanted access. And she believed the only thing standing in between her and a fortune of $9.1 million was the man she had vowed to love. But greed is a poor strategist, because while Claire thought she had orchestrated the perfect story, she never accounted for one variable: a teenage girl who wasn't supposed to hear her whisper the truth. A whisper that exposed everything. Claire was arrested at 7:18 a.m. the following Wednesday. She didn't scream. She didn't faint. She simply lowered her head as officers secured her wrists. Her only request was to speak to Lily, a request that was denied. During questioning, she denied every allegation. She claimed the vial wasn't hers. She insisted the messages were innocent. She said Lily misunderstood. She blamed stress, exhaustion, grief. She cried, finally, but none of it sounded real. Meanwhile, Evan tried to disappear. He booked a flight out of state under an alias, but investigators were already watching him. He was detained at the airport, carrying a suitcase that included passports, cash, and clothing inconsistent with a man planning a brief trip. Under pressure, he cracked before Claire did. He admitted to the affair. He admitted they had discussed a future together. But he insisted, allegedly, that the plan to poison Daniel was entirely Claire's idea. He portrayed himself as a victim of her manipulation, a man seduced into emotional entanglement but unwilling to commit a crime. Investigators didn't fully believe him, but his cooperation strengthened their case. The trial became a spectacle. The courtroom filled with reporters, community members, and people who once knew the Harpers as the perfect family. Lily, under protective counseling, took the stand. Her voice trembled as she repeated the words she had heard. "It has to be tonight." She described her fear, her confusion, her heartbreak. Claire watched her daughter with an expression that wavered between sorrow and resentment. She kept glancing toward the door, as though waiting for someone to walk in and rescue her story. No one did. When the verdict finally came, it was decisive. Guilty. Guilty of conspiracy. Guilty of premeditated murder. Guilty of attempting to secure financial gain through calculated deception. The sentence was severe. The silence in the courtroom afterward was even heavier. As she was led away, Claire turned her head one last time, searching for Lily's face. But Lily wasn't looking at her. She was staring down at her hands, the same hands that had held her phone the night she recorded the whisper that exposed her mother's darkest secret. The aftermath reshaped the Harper legacy. Daniel's company was placed under temporary trusteeship until Lily reached adulthood. Community members rallied to support her, offering care, stability, and distance from the chaos. The home where everything unfolded was eventually sold. No one wanted to live inside walls that had witnessed such cold betrayal. Evan received a reduced sentence in exchange for cooperation, but his career, reputation, and influence evaporated. The financial empire he once boasted about collapsed under scrutiny. He was left with nothing but a criminal record and the echoes of choices that destroyed multiple lives. For Lily, healing became a slow, fragile journey. She visited her father's grave often, leaving notes folded beneath stones, notes she never showed anyone. She struggled with insomnia, the memory of that whisper haunting her dreams. But over time, she found strength in telling her story, in honoring the truth her father never had a chance to defend, in understanding that sometimes survival requires confronting the darkest parts of those we once trusted. Late one evening, nearly a year after the trial, she returned to the kitchen where everything had begun. The house was empty now, stripped of furniture, waiting for the new owners. She stood in the doorway, the same spot where she had once frozen in fear. This time she stepped forward. She placed her hand on the cold countertop and whispered, "I'm sorry, Dad." And for the first time, the weight inside her chest loosened, because the truth had been exposed, the lies dismantled, the darkness dragged into light. And yet, the question that lingered, the question that would echo long after the last courtroom door closed, was simple. How many secrets buried beneath the quiet routines of ordinary families remain hidden? How many stories of betrayal, greed, and broken trust lie just beneath the surface, waiting for a single whisper to bring them crashing into the open? Sometimes the most dangerous mysteries aren't found in distant cities or abandoned wasteland roads. Sometimes they rise from the people we love most. And in the Harper case, the silence that filled their home was not peace. It was the calm before the truth was exposed. If this story left you reflecting on the fragile lines between trust and deception, feel free to share your thoughts. Your perspective adds depth to the conversation and helps keep stories like this alive so that no lesson is forgotten and no warning goes unheard.